Close your eyes and take a deep breath. You are home now, and the world outside can wait. Welcome to another episode of Z in History. In 1752, wealthy travelers came to Venice to buy history. But if history wasn't available, men like Luca were paid to invent it. Tonight, 3 men are trapped in a damp attic with a masterpiece that looks too new. With only 5 hours before a suspicious Jesuit priest arrives, they must use wood ash, stale bread, and tea to fake a century of decay. If the lie holds, they're rich. If it fails, the galleys await. Chapter 1: The Attic on the Canal. If you had stepped into that attic back in the spring of 1752, the first thing that would have hit you wasn't the view of the Venetian lagoon, but the stinging, medicinal smell of raw turpentine and the heavy, earthy scent of linseed oil. Luca stood there in the center of the room, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floorboards, as he stared at a painting that was technically a masterpiece, but practically a death sentence. It was a Caravaggio, at least. It looked exactly like one in terms of the brushwork and the drama. The problem was that it looked like it had been finished 10 minutes ago. The colors were too vibrant, the surface was too slick, and the white paint was so bright it practically hummed in the dim candlelight. Across the small room, his old partner Pippo was hunched over a heavy stone slab. His back curved like a mountain as he ground white lead rocks into a fine, lethal powder. Pippo was a perfectionist of the old school, a man who knew that the experts in the 18th century didn't just look at the art, they looked at the chemistry. If they found even a trace of a modern pigment or a synthetic binder, the whole scam would collapse, and they'd both be rotting in a damp cell beneath the Doge's palace by dawn. Pippo kept glancing at the heavy oak door, his breath coming in short, nervous hitches, convinced that the city guards were already navigating the narrow canal below. Luca didn't say a word to calm him. He couldn't afford to lose his own focus. He reached out and lightly touched the very edge of the oil. It was still soft, reflecting the flicker of the tallow candles like a fresh, polished mirror. In the world of high-end art forgery, that shine is the ultimate giveaway. It tells the viewer the paint hasn't had time to sink into the canvas over decades of oxidation. They had exactly 5 hours to kill that shine, to tire out the colors, and to turn a brand new piece of linen into a 100-year-old relic that could fool a Jesuit priest. Luca picked up a palette knife, the cold metal feeling heavy in his hand, and prepared to start the long process of lying to the world. Chapter 2: Too Much Light. The biggest giveaway on the canvas was the white paint. On a genuine 17th century masterpiece, the whites aren't actually white anymore. They've spent 100 years turning a creamy, yellowish bone color because of the way the lead reacts with the air and the smoke from church candles. But Luca's highlighter's sharp glint on the saint's forehead was a bright, aggressive silver that practically screamed 1752. It was a beautiful stroke of art, but a terrible piece of forgery. Their middleman, a man named Marco, who dressed in velvet but had the nerves of a cornered rat, was pacing the room so hard the old floorboards were groaning and vibrating. Every time he moved, he kicked up a cloud of invisible dust that threatened to settle into the wet paint and create permanent, ugly bumps on the surface. Luca finally had to grab Marco by the shoulder and shove him into a dark corner, just to get enough breathing room to think. Luca reached for a jar of sun-thickened turpentine. This wasn't the thin, watery stuff you'd find in a common workshop. This had been sitting in a glass jar on a sunny windowsill for 6 weeks until it had turned into a thick, syrupy amber liquid. This was the key to his first trick. The lean wash. Luca began to mix a tiny amount of this syrup with a dull, earthy pigment called burnt umber. He wasn't painting a new layer. He was starving the oil that was already there. He brushed this thin, hungry mixture over the brightest spots of the painting, watching closely as the chemicals began to react. The turpentine acted like a sponge, pulling the excess oil out of the lower layers of paint and bringing it to the surface where it could evaporate. Slowly, the aggressive silver on the saint's forehead began to dull down, turning into a chalky, exhausted texture that looked like it had seen better days. It was a high-stakes gamble. If Luca made the mixture just a little too strong, the solvent would eat right through the image and dissolve the saint's face into a muddy puddle on the floor. He worked with agonizing slowness, his eyes inches from the canvas, watching for the exact moment the shine died. Chapter 3: The Middleman's Knock. Just as the surface of the paint started to lose its oily glow, a sharp, rhythmic knock at the heavy attic door made all 3 men freeze. Marco reached for a dagger he didn't know how to use, but it was just the delivery Luca had been waiting for. A heavy iron brazier filled with fresh charcoal. In the damp, salty air of Venice, paint stays tacky for weeks, which is a total disaster when you're trying to fake a century of aging in a single night. Luca needed the room to stop being an attic and start being a kill. He signaled for Pippo to light the charcoal, and soon the small room was filled with a dry, intense heat that made the scent of the turpentine even more pungent and dizzying. The goal was to bake the painting, artificially accelerating the drying process to simulate 100 years of hot Italian summers in the span of a few hours. Marco was tasked with pumping the leather bellows, a job that kept him busy and away from the artwork. His face turned a bright, sweaty red as he forced air into the glowing coals, the rhythmic whoosh of the bellows providing a jagged soundtrack to their crime. Luca, meanwhile, took a wide, soft brush made of squirrel hair and prepared his next layer. This was a scorched glazer mixture of walnut oil that had been intentionally overheated until it turned a deep tobacco brown color. As the room grew hotter and the air grew thinner, Luca began to sweep this warm glaze over the entire canvas. It was like applying a filter of time. The bright blues of the sky turned a murky teal, and the reds of the drapery took on the heavy, somber tone of a masterpiece that had spent a lifetime in a dim, incense-filled cathedral. The attic now smelled like a mix of melting animal fat, burnt oil, and desperation. Luca could feel the sweat dripping down his neck, but he didn't dare stop. In this heat, the glaze would set in minutes, and if he didn't spread it perfectly, the painting would be covered in permanent, streaky tide marks that no expert would ever accept as natural aging. Chapter 4: The First Layer of Time. Once the surface of the painting had warmed up enough to lose its initial stickiness, it was time for what Luca called the ghost layer. This wasn't about adding more paint. It was about adding the invisible weight of a century. Luca didn't reach for a brush this time. Instead, he pulled a small wooden bowl from the shadows beneath the workbench. It was filled with cold, grey wood ash he had collected from the fireplace downstairs. This ash was the secret to creating museum dust that fine, silvery haze that settles into the microscopic pits of an old oil painting over decades of hanging in a drafty, soot-filled palace. He took a square of fine, unbleached silk and wrapped it around a ball of raw cotton to create a pouncer, a soft, rounded tool that looked like a large mushroom. He dipped this tool into the ash, tapped off the excess until only a ghostly cloud remained, and then began the slow, rhythmic work of pouncing the soot directly into the darkest shadows of the painting dot. It was a hypnotic, repetitive motion that filled the grain of the canvas with a fine, dry silt. If Luca pressed too hard, the soot would become a permanent, muddy smudge in the wet oil. If he was too light, the ash would simply blow away the moment someone sneezed. He had to find the exact balance, working in small, overlapping circles that started at the edges and moved toward the center. He watched as the deep, obsidian blacks of the Caravaggio stopped looking like fresh, oily shadows and started looking like they had been gathering the grime of a smoky Venetian church for generations. Pippo leaned in, his spectacles sliding down his nose, pointing with a stained finger toward the corners of the canvas where dust naturally accumulates most heavily near a frame. Luca followed the old man's lead, building up layers of gray in the crevices of the brushstrokes, creating troughs of dirt that looked entirely accidental. Marco watched from the corner, his eyes wide as he realized that a handful of fireplace waste was turning their 1,000-ducat fraught into a believable relic. The only sound in the room was the soft, muffled thud-thud of the silk against the linen, a heartbeat of artificial age that seemed to pull the painting further and further into the past. Chapter 5. The Enemy in the Air. The work was going perfectly until the wind shifted. A low, mournful whistle started to come through the gaps in the attic's wooden shutters, the sirocco in Venice. This warm, southern wind is a curse for artists because it brings the heavy, salty mist of the lagoon directly into the house. Within minutes, the air in the attic turned into a damp sponge. Luca felt the change immediately. The fine wood ash he had been pouncing started to clump together into tiny, grey beads of mud instead of staying as a delicate mist. It was a total disaster. If that moisture got trapped under the next layer of varnish, the painting would bloom, a term for a cloudy, white haze that appears as the water tries to escape the oil. Once a painting blooms, it's ruined. It looks like it's covered in a layer of mold that no amount of cleaning can remove. Luca went into a state of controlled, silent panic. He signaled for every tallow candle in the room to be gathered and moved into a tight circle around the easel. He needed to create a microclimate wall of dry, rising heat that would act as a barrier against the damp Venetian night. The attic soon smelled like a slaughterhouse from the melting animal fat, mixed with the sharp, acidic temps of the heated resins. Luca took a bone-dry, long-haired brush and began to whisk the surface of the painting with frantic, light strokes, trying to keep the air moving so the moisture couldn't settle. His arm was aching from the repetitive motion, and the heat from the candles was so intense it was starting to singe the hair on his knuckles. For over an hour, the three men stood in a circle of fire, barely breathing, fighting the very atmosphere of the city to keep their secret dry. Pippo stood ready with a warm, dry cloth to douse any sparks, while Marco held a fan, his face slick with sweat. They were three men holding back the sea, with nothing but a few dozen candles and a desperate need to stay out of prison. Chapter 6: A Lesson in Cracks. The air eventually dried out, but they had lost an hour, and the sun was getting closer. Now came the scariest, most violent part of the whole night, the crackler. Real old paintings have a beautiful, intricate spiderweb of tiny cracks where the layers of paint have dried, shrunk and brittleized over 70 or 80 years. To fake this in a single night, Luca used a trick that would have made a real master weep. He pulled out a jar of fish glue, a foul-smelling, sticky liquid made from boiling the skins and bladders of sturgeon. He began to paint a thick, glass-like layer of this glue over the entire image, covering the saint's face, the shadows, and the highlights. As the glue hit the heat of the charcoal brazier, it began to dry much faster than the oil paint trapped underneath it. The physics of the scam were brutal, because the glue dried at a different rate than the oil. It began to shrink and pull at the surface, literally ripping the top layer of paint into thousands of tiny, microscopic fractures. You could actually hear it happening, a soft, high-pitched snap-pop-crackle that sounded like thin ice breaking on a winter pond. Marco nearly fainted when he saw the face of the saint start to shatter. Convinced that Luca had just destroyed months of hard work, he tried to grab Luca's arm to make him stop, but Pippo held him back with a surprising amount of strength, whispering that this was the only way. Luca used a small leather bellows to blow cold air onto the hot glue, accelerating the shrinking process until the entire canvas was covered in a perfect geometric web of cracks. It looked like a disaster, a ruined mess of shattered pigment, but Luca knew better. He knew that without those cracks, no Jesuit expert or English lord would ever believe the painting was more than a week old. They were destroying the painting to save the lie, and the sound of the fracturing oil was the only thing that mattered in the silence of the attic. Chapter 7: The Tea Stain Glaze. The cracking had finished, leaving the saint's face looking like a shattered mirror, but there was still a major technical problem. The cracks were invisible. To a naked eye, they were just tiny, clear mountain ranges of fractured glue. Real age doesn't just break the paint. It fills those breaks with a century of soot, skin oils, and fireplace smoke. Luca needed to ink the fractures. He reached for a small iron pot that had been simmering on the edge of the charcoal brazier. Inside was a brew of incredibly strong black tea, boiled down until it was as thick as syrup and mixed with a single drop of iron gall ink. This was the grime of ages in a liquid form. Luca dipped a wide, flat brush into the dark liquid and swept it across the entire canvas in bold, horizontal strokes. Marco let out a muffled gasp as the beautiful red drapery and the pale skin of the saint were suddenly buried under a muddy, brown sludge. It looked like an act of vandalism. But as the tea stain hit the fractures, physics took over. The liquid rushed into the valleys of the cracks, sucked in by capillary action, while staying thin on the high points of the paint. Luca didn't wait for it to dry. He grabbed a large, damp sea sponge and began to wipe the surface with a firm, rhythmic motion. The result was a transformation that made even Pippo lean in and whistle. The dark tea stayed trapped in the spiderweb pattern, highlighting every single crack with a deep, brownish-black line. The bright, fresh skin of the saint now looked like weathered parchment that had survived a dozen wars. To finish the effect, Luca took a tiny sewing needle and started picking at the junctions where the cracks met. flicking away microscopic specks of paint to create losses. It was tedious, surgical work, but it added the final touch of where that suggested the painting had been handled, cleaned and neglected by 100 different hands over 100 years. Chapter 8. The Breadcrumb Trick. With the canvas looking sufficiently ancient, the focus shifted to the frame. It was a beautiful piece of Venetian craftsmanship, but it was far too bright. The gold leaf shined with a metallic newness that would have alerted even a casual observer. To fix this, Luca used one of the strangest tools in a forger's kit, a stale, rock-hard loaf of bread. He took a heavy knife, sliced the loaf in half, and handed one piece to Pippo. They began to scrub the hard crust of the bread against the gilded edges of the frame with a dry, grating sound. The crumbs acted like a natural, irregular sandpaper, dulling the shine of the gold and creating a brushed texture that mimicked decades of a maid's dusting cloth. It was a crude technique, but it worked better than any metal tool because the bread broke apart unevenly, creating the kind of honest scratches that only happen over time. While Luca worked on the gilding, Pippo was busy with a fine needle, poking hundreds of tiny wormholes into the soft pine of the frame. He wasn't just poking holes. He was blowing a mixture of dark wax and soot into each one to make it look like the wood was rotting and occupied by insects from the inside out. Marco was tasked with the patina. He took a handful of rotten stone, a fine, grey volcanic powder, and began to rub it into the deep, recessed carvings of the wood. This powder settled into the shadows, creating that greasy, grey-green accumulation that you only see on gold that hasn't been polished since the previous century. The attic was filled with the sound of scratching bread and the smell of old wax. By the time they were done, the frame no longer looked like it had come from a workshop down the street. It looked like a heavy, somber relic pulled from a forgotten crypt. Every scratch and every wormhole was a silent argument for the painting's authenticity. Chapter 9. The Final Inspection. The sun was just a hint of grey on the horizon when Luca finally stepped back. His eyes were burning from the smoke of the tallow candles, and his hands were stained a deep, permanent brown from the tea and ink. He signaled for Marco to blow out the extra candles, leaving only a single low-hanging lantern near the floor. This was the ultimate test. Art experts don't look at a painting head-on. They look at it from a raking angle to see how the light hits the surface. Under the low light, the painting no longer had that oily, modern flash. Instead, it had a deep, matte glow. The layers of ash and tea stain had created a visual depth that made the image look like it was sitting behind 100 years of history. Pippo crawled behind the easel to check the back of the canvas. This was the part most forgers forgot. He had spent the previous evening staining the new white linen with a mixture of coffee and soot until it turned the deep tobacco brown of 17th century fabric. He had even used a rusted iron file to fray the edges of the cloth where it met the wooden stretcher bars. Everything looked correct. The smell of the attic had even changed. The sharp scent of fresh oil had been buried under the smell of burnt walnut and old wood. Marco was busy practicing his discovery story, whispering to himself about a ruined chapel in the mountains, but Luca wasn't listening. He was focused on the saint's eyes. For a heartbeat, the forgery felt real to him, too. The lie was as complete as chemistry and manual labor could make it. The three of them stood in the cooling attic, three ghosts waiting for the arrival of the man who would either make them rich or see them hanged. Chapter 10: The Crate and the Seal. The packing was a mission in itself, because a brand new shipping box would have been a flashing red light to any customs officer or curious priest. Luca had spent weeks sourcing old, grayed-out timber from a broken-down fishing boat, wood that had been pickled in the salt of the lagoon until it was as hard as stone. This wasn't just a box. It was the final layer of the costume. Luca and Pippo stood on either side of the easel, their hands trembling slightly from the sheer physical exhaustion of the night. They reached out and gripped the frame, lifting the Caravaggio with the kind of terrified gentleness you'd use to move a sleeping predator. One slip, one accidental thumbprint on that soft, tea-stained varnish, and the whole illusion would smudge into a modern mess. They lowered the painting into the crate, which had been lined not with modern paper or soft silk, but with rough, hand-woven linen that Pippo had boiled in vinegar to make it look antique. Marco was waiting with the hammer, but Luca stopped him. He took a handful of the leftover wood ash and tossed it into the bottom of the crate, letting a fine grey cloud settle over the linen. He wanted the Englishman to find honest dust when he opened the lid. Marco then began to drive the hand-forged iron nails into the wood. Each clack-clack-clack of the hammer felt like a heartbeat in the quiet attic. Marco worked with a frantic, messy energy, his face slick with sweat, even though the room was cooling down. Once the lid was secure, Luca pulled out a heavy stick of red sealing wax. He melted a large, bubbling pool over the seams and pressed a generic, weathered signet ring into the cooling goop. It wasn't a real coat of arms, just a vague, ecclesiastical-looking shape that suggested the painting had been officially catalogued by a church long ago. The secret was now locked in a wooden tomb, and the three men stood back, the silence of the room suddenly feeling very heavy. Chapter 11: The Handover. The boat arrived exactly as the first grey light of morning began to hit the water of the canal. Two men in heavy, dark cloaks climbed the narrow wooden stairs, their boots thumping with a rhythmic authority that made Pippo sink into a corner, his head bowed as if he were already in a courtroom. The first man was Lord Egerton, an Englishman who looked at the dusty, soot-stained attic with an expression of pure disgust. But it was the second man who mattered, the Jesuit. He was a small, sharp-featured man with eyes like a hawk, and he carried a leather-bound case that likely contained a set of magnifying lenses and chemical reagents. He didn't say a word. He simply walked straight to the crate. Luca stayed in the back, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Keeping his hands tucked into his smock to hide the stains of the night's work, Marco stepped forward, his voice cracking as he started his rehearsed story about the ruined chapel. But the Jesuit raised a single, gloved hand to silence him. The priest wasn't there for a story. He was there for the physics. He knelt by the crate and opened his kit, producing a small vial of strong wine spirit and a magnifying glass. This was the moment where many forgers met their end. The priest asked Marco to pry back a corner of the lid, and then he leaned in close to the saint's face. He performed the solvent test, rubbing a tiny drop of alcohol onto a dark patch of the background. Because Luca had used the lean turpentine trick to starve the oil, the paint held firm. It didn't dissolve like fresh paint would have. Then The Jesuit spent a terrifyingly long time staring at the crackler through his glass, looking for the telltale V-shape of a natural crack. Luca's fish glue trick had worked perfectly. The fractures were deep and jagged. After what felt like an eternity, the priest stood up, wiped his lens, and gave a single, curt nod to the Englishman. The heavy leather bag of gold coins was placed on the workbench with a solid, metallic clink, and the crate was carried out into the mist. Chapter 12. The Sun Over the Lagoon. The attic was suddenly, violently empty. The Caravaggio was gone, drifting down the Grand Canal toward a ship that would carry it to a mansion in London, where it would hang on a wall for 100 years as a testament to a master who never actually touched it. Marco didn't stick around to celebrate. He grabbed his share of the gold and vanished down the stairs, likely heading for the nearest tavern to drink away the memory of his terror. Pippo stayed a little longer, staring at the empty easel with a look of profound relief. Before he too shuffled off to his bed in the cellar, his old bones finally giving out. Luca was the only one left in the wreckage of the night. The room was a disaster of breadcrumbs, wood ash, and empty jars. But the heavy weight of the lie had been lifted. He walked out onto the small stone balcony and watched the sun finally clear the rooftops of the ring. The water of the lagoon was turning into a sheet of hammered silver, and the city was waking up with its usual rhythmic chaos. He could hear the calls of the fishmongers and the splashing of oars, sounds that felt grounded and honest compared to the frantic chemistry of the night. Luca felt a deep, hollow exhaustion settle into his chest. He went back inside and began the slow, quiet task of cleaning his tools. He dumped the remaining ash into the canal and washed his hands in a basin of cold water, scrubbing until the stains of the century-old paint finally faded from his skin. The crime was over, buried under the blue Venetian sky. He sat on his wooden stool, leaned his head against the cool brick of the wall, and let the warmth of the sun pull him down into a deep, dreamless sleep. The work was finished, and for now, the world was exactly as it seemed.